kawan yang saya hormati, siang ini kami Perludem punya kesempatan istimewa karena atas prakarsa IFES dan teman-temannya telah hadir di depan kita Pak Magnus, salah satu ahli atau pengamat internasional yang fokus ke isu dana politik, yang dari beliau kita akan banyak mendapat informasi, pengetahuan dan macam-macam yang tentu saja sangat bermanfaat buat kita yang tengah memperjuangkan isu-isu demokrasi, isu-isu transparansi pengelolaan dana politik, penggunaan dana kampanye dan lain-lain. Nah, nanti kita akan diskusi dengan beliau. Buku beliau sangat terkenal, selalu dipegang para aktivis yang mencoba memahami dunia politik demokratis, karena beliau studi di banyak negara, komparasi antara satu negara dengan negara yang lain, sehingga banyak hal yang bisa kita dapatkan dari buku ini. Sering kita kutip kalau kita bicara. Nah, Titik mungkin bisa menunjukkan bukunya. Ini salah satu buku beliau, ya. Salah tiganya masih banyak. Nah, kita akan diskusi soal itu, dan kami berterima kasih kepada Diva Australia dan Diva Kanada yang mensupport cara ini. Telah hadir di hadapan kita Pak Luke Arnold. Oh, maaf. Kemudian beliau adalah sekretari dari Unit Bantuan Keadilan dan Pemerintahan Demokrasi Diva. Kemudian Ibu Irina. Terima kasih Kak bosan-bosan datang ke sini. Beliau adalah Senior Program Manager dari Unit Keadilan dan Pemerintahan Demokrasi atau Diva. Langsung saja kita persilahkan Titi untuk memandu kegiatan ini. Moga-moga benar-benar bermanfaat, dan mohon maaf kalau misalnya dalam proses penyelenggaraan ini masih ada kekurangan atau kesalahan di sana sini. Terima kasih, selamat berdiskusi. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Terima kasih Pak Didi. Harusnya Pak Didi yang jadi moderator, tapi konon katanya anak buah nggak boleh melawan apa kata bos, bisa kualat gitu. Jadi karena dia minta saya untuk moderasi, saya akan gantikan beliau. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat siang, salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Rekan-rekan, teman-teman, Bapak Ibu, Abang, Mas, Mbak semua, kami sampaikan terima kasih atas kehadirannya siang ini. Sangat berbahagia kita semua bisa berkumpul pada hari ini. Hari ini kita akan mendengarkan kuliah umum dari Bapak Magnus Ohman tentang Political and Campaign Finance from International Perspective. Jadi tentang dana politik dan dana kampanye dari dalam perspektif internasional. Bagi saya pribadi, Pak Magnus ini orang yang saya bayangkan untuk bertemu sejak lama sebenarnya, karena sudah sangat familiar dengan buku-bukunya yang kalau kami melakukan riset pasti ada rujukannya itu ke publikasi dari beliau. Jadi ibaratnya ini ada penggemar yang bertemu dengan idolanya gitu. Jadi terima kasih kepada Pak Luke, Mbak Irin, sehingga kami bisa difasilitasi mendapatkan ilmu dari orang-orang yang selama ini hanya kita baca publikasinya, dan hari ini bisa hadir dan bergabung bersama kita langsung. Sebelum mulai, saya akan membacakan dulu biografi beliau. Pak Magnus Ohman telah bekerja di berbagai isu keuangan politik sejak akhir tahun 90-an, khususnya dalam bidang pengungkapan dan pengawasan keuangan politik, sistem pendanaan publik, dan solusi yang berkesinambungan. beliau telah melakukan riset baik pada tingkat nasional maupun tren dan praktek-praktek level makro dalam pengaturan keuangan politik. Beliau juga telah bekerja sama dengan pembuat undang-undang atau legislator, lembaga-lembaga penegak hukum, organisasi masyarakat sipil, media, dan partai-partai politik di banyak negara. Ketika bekerja dengan IFES, Pak Ohman telah mendukung inisiatif keuangan politik di negara-negara misalnya Afghanistan, Armenia, Republik Ceko, Mesir, Georgia, Indonesia, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Liberia, Moldova, Nigeria, Filipina, Serbia, Sierra Leone, Tunisia, Ukraina, dan Yaman. Nah, dari negara-negara tadi kita bisa elaborasi ya, mana yang best practices-nya atau mungkin mana yang kurang baik tapi bisa menjadi pembelajaran untuk kita. Ini juga membanggakan ini sebagai fasilitator bridge. Pak Ilham pasti senang. Beliau juga merupakan ketua tim penulis modul Building Resource in Democracy, Governance and Election atau BRIDGE terkait keuangan politik. Nah, Pak Ilham ini kebetulan accredited fasilitatornya BRIDGE. Pak Umum juga memiliki gelar doktor dalam bidang ilmu politik dari Universitas, ini cara bacanya semoga nggak salah, Uppsala, Swedia. Bener ya? Bener ya kalau gitu. Rundown kita hari ini, Pak Ohman akan mempresentasikan secara garis besar. Pertama tentang pengaturan yang efektif terkait dengan sumbangan dan pembatasan serta larangan dana kampanye. Itu fokus pertama beliau. Yang kedua, beliau juga akan mengulas tentang pengaturan terkait dengan akses terhadap bantuan keuangan untuk partai politik dari negara. Jadi subsidi negara untuk partai politik. Nah, ini isu yang saat ini sedang hangat ya. Tiba-tiba kita dengar awal tahun 1 triliun untuk satu partai politik. Ini mungkin akan dielaborasi walaupun diskusinya jauh berkembang soal ini di Indonesia sekarang. Yang terakhir, isu yang akan dibahas juga tentang pelaporan dana kampanye, transparansi dan pengawasan formal oleh negara. Ini 3 isu yang akan banyak beliau kupas. Teman-teman, saya kira karena ini momen berharga, momen penting yang jarang kita punya, kita langsung saja mendengarkan presentasi dari Pak Magnus Ohman. Nanti teman-teman akan diberikan kesempatan untuk melakukan tanya jawab dengan beliau. Kepada Pak Magnus, waktu dan tempat saya persilakan.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for coming. As you can see in the agenda, we're going to break a few times for questions and answers, but having said that, I'd like us to have an informal discussion. So if at any point you have any questions or you have any comments, just raise your hand and we can deal with it. So I work with global finance. That's pretty much all I do. And I don't expect to be running out of work anytime soon. I've reviewed the laws in 180 countries and worked in between 30 and 40. I've yet to find a single country that doesn't have problems with money and politics. I know a lot about how it works in different countries. I'm not an expert on Indonesia, but you are. So together we can discuss how the experience in different countries can be applied to the Indonesian context. Because I believe that countries can learn a lot from the experience in other countries, while realizing that whatever we need in our country has to be specific for our context. I'm sometimes asked which country is the best in these issues, and it's a very easy answer. There is no country that is dealing with these issues full on. Every country has problems in one way or another. Political finance is a term I'll be using a lot. If you hear me say money in politics, don't confuse that with money politics, as it's used in Indonesia, because that's something different. Okay? Most of the time I talk about political finance. By that we mean the financing of political parties and the financing of election campaigns. So how money is raised and how money is spent in relation to parties and to election campaigns. And of course we can have much broader definitions. A lot relates to a lot of different issues. But those are the ones I think we should focus on today. Political finance is crucially connected to key aspects of any modern democracy. Money is necessary for free and fair elections. Parties and candidates cannot run election campaigns without money. But at the same time, money in election campaigns always means potential problems. There's always the risk that money, rather than the view of the voter, comes to dominate the elections. Effective governance means that decisions must be taken based on solid research and information. That requires resources. But when, for example, public contracts is not given to the company that has the best bid, but to the company that gave the most money during the election campaign, you don't have effective governance. As we all know, democracy is not just elections. Democracy is an ongoing dialogue between the people and politicians and parties. That dialogue requires money. But if politicians listen not to the people, but to whoever gave them money in the election campaign, we don't have democracy. And finally, access to transparent, regulated resources can help to insulate politicians from corruption. The very fact that there is a lot of money in politics, at least in Indonesian politics, means that there are always temptations to engage in corrupt activities. So, money is necessary and problematic. Our solution cannot be to try to take away money from politics, because we will fail, and the only thing we might achieve is to remove democratic, engaged political process. Okay, so it's very useful to start with what are the international documents, what are the standards, what are the binding commitments. If I were to speak about voter registration or restricting, we could go on for quite some time. When we speak about international documents on political finance, that's it. There is one sub-clause in the UN Convention Against Corruption which says that countries should consider introducing rules for transparency in parties and elections. Note one word. It says consider. What it means is they should think about it. But if they decide, should we have these rules? No. Okay, that's fine. Just doing that means that they fulfill the criteria. I'm actually flying from here to Russia for the 6th State Party Conference on the UN Convention Against Corruption. All we do is trying to figure out how we can make this convention work. It's not working today. There are a couple of other documents mentioning these issues, but it is very, very little. Okay, so I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about different types of regulations. We can very broadly divide these into 3 categories that can help us in our thinking. Many regulations are restrictive. So we're trying to limit in some way how parties and politicians can raise money or spend money. Okay. Does that work?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. We also have enhanced sense, which is basically state funding. There's a lot of discussion about this in Indonesia right now. The political parties, surprise, surprise, are in favor of increasing state funding. But of course, we also have the background in Indonesia of having had significantly higher state funding in the past. Talked a lot about that. What we must never forget are the 3rd type of regulations that are dealing with transparency, financial reporting, reviews, and making the information available to the public. These are the main types of regulations that I will be talking about. I'll talk about different types of bans, and you're not allowed to raise money this way, you're not allowed to spend money that way. Quantitative limits, you cannot give more than this amount, receive or spend more than this amount. Talk about state funding, and talk about it. It's very important that if you remember anything from our discussion here today, it is that these rules mean nothing at all unless they are actually being implemented. The world is full of regulations on political finance. When we did a review of 180 countries, I thought we'd probably find campaign finance rules in 2/3, 3/4 of countries. We didn't find any country that doesn't have rules on political finance. Nauru has, I think, 8,000 inhabitants, something like that. They have rules on political finance. Sometimes these rules are just a ban on vote buying or a ban on abuse of state resources, but it's always there. The vast majority of these rules are ignored. If we are in Nauru, or in Indonesia, or the Central African Republic, or Canada, or Sweden, most of the rules are not being followed. So, whenever we talk about regulations, we have to think about how can they be implemented. How will we know if someone is breaking these rules? If we can't say this is how we will know if someone breaks the rule, then let's not have the rule. Starting with things that are banned. So certain types of behavior are considered so bad that they have to be banned completely. Right? The most common is to ban state resources being given to a particular party or candidate. So this is different from state funding, which is regulated and controlled. But you can't use money from the Ministry of Home Affairs to support a particular party. That's banned almost everywhere. Two things about most of these tables. It's all percentages. You see there are two figures. The first one is the political parties. The second one is the candidates. So in Asia, foreign donations are banned in 89% of the countries to political parties, but only in 65% of countries to candidates. Second thing, if you're curious, MENA is the Middle East and North Africa. So foreign donations, like in Indonesia, are also banned in most countries. Working with state institutions that have to monitor compliance with these rules, I'm often sitting and sighing about how can we possibly try to implement that ban. How do we know when money is coming from? Many laws don't specify if money from citizens living abroad is part of such a ban. For a country like Indonesia, which has a lot of citizens living in other countries, that's a key issue. Logically, citizens living abroad should be allowed to make contributions because they are citizens. How on earth am I going to check as a state body if money came from him or it came from a foreign body? Most countries ban anonymous donations. A number of countries has limits allowing very small anonymous donations. Only about 1 in 5 countries ban donations from corporations. Something we don't have here. I know that's been discussed as well. Okay. Just to give you one example. On all these maps, green means yes, the country has a rule of this kind. Red means no, it doesn't. And grey means either we don't know or they don't actually hold elections. This ban of foreign donations exists in almost all countries. Then we have the issue of limiting donations. So we're saying we don't want to ban certain things completely, but we want to limit how much you can give. And the purpose of donation limits is quite straightforward, is to say that we don't want politicians or parties to become dependent on individuals, maybe corporations, maybe organizations like trade unions, have a lot of them. So we set the limit. Most countries don't have limits on donations. But a number of them, about 30%, do. And you can see there's a slight variation between if you have an annual limit on how much you can give per year, how much you can give in an election, and so on. Quite interesting to see that there is a relationship where many of these rules exist in various parts of the world, but not in countries that have not come very far at all in democratic development, and in countries that have come very far in democratic development. So there is a different logic. Sometimes rules aren't in place because they haven't got there yet. In other countries, they are not considered as appropriate in the democratic process. Geography test, does anyone know which country is yellow here? I don't, so okay, I believe you. I have no idea why it's yellow. think that's just a mistake. And I made the map. Could be true. We have limits on donations in Indonesia. If you're an individual and you're not a member of a party, you're allowed to give to a party 1 billion rupees. If we translate that into dollars and take into account differences in purchasing power parity, how much far money will go in different countries, we can make a comparison by different countries. I haven't been able to find any country that has a higher donation limit anywhere in the world than Indonesia. It doesn't necessarily mean that the level is wrong. It depends on what it's there to do. But if it's there to make sure that big people cannot give a lot of money, well, 1 billion sounds quite a lot. Then there is the issue of spending limits. And this, in my discussions with people here and what I've seen in discussions that have happened here before, is something that's discussed quite a lot in Indonesia. The logic is different. Donation limits is to stop those with a lot of money from controlling, influencing parties and politicians. Spending limits is more about reducing the advantage of parties and politicians with a lot of money. These are more common for candidates, about 45% globally, than they are for parties, 30%. One thing I'd like you to always keep an eye out for is, do the rules for parties and candidates match? In Asia in general, over 60% of countries have limits on spending for parties, for candidates. Half of that have limits for parties. What does that mean? It means that if I'm a candidate, I have reached the spending limit. I'll give the rest of my money to my party and they will spend it for me. And there's no problem. The spending limit for candidates becomes useless. There must be harmony between the rules of parties and the candidates. This then looks at the issue of what is the spending limit. This is expressed as how much you can spend per eligible voter in an average constituency. In dollars, taking account of purchasing power parity. We do not have spending limits in national elections in Indonesia right now. But we had a discussion just before this. There are the experiment of spending limits for the regular head elections. And I did some quick calculations. For at least for smaller areas, the spending limits will end up at roughly $3.50 per eligible vote. So for most countries, we are somewhere about less than $0.50. But Indonesia is joining Cyprus very, very high up. Cyprus is a very small country. Indonesia is not. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that the spending limit that is being attempted is wrong, but it should definitely be thought about. What is the right level? The right level is the level that achieves the goal you're trying to do. I mentioned that most countries don't have limits on spending. If we look at Southeast Asia, It's only Thailand and the Philippines that have spending limits parties today on national elections. But for candidates, it's a larger amount of countries. The limit varies very significantly. Expressed as the limit per voter in rupiah, it's roughly 11 rupiah per voter in parliamentary elections in Malaysia. Very, very, very low. It's up to 18,000 rupiah per voter in parliamentary elections in Singapore. There's huge variation. Spending limits are easier to implement than donation limits. The reason is that donations we can't see. It's very often someone giving money to someone through a bank transfer or in cash or in check somewhere. Or can share his experience of fundraising in Canadian elections. It's not easy to see. Campaign spending we cancel because there's no point in running a campaign if people can't see what you're doing. TV advertising, newspapers, banners, and so on. Some spending parties don't want to see vote buying, bribing election officials. But those things have nothing to do with spending. Do not think you can introduce a spending limit and it will have an impact on vote buying, because that's an illegal activity. Right? Do expect that if you set the spending limits and it's fairly low, the illegal activities will increase. Because if I'm a candidate, I want to win the election. You're saying you can only spend this amount. I would think, what can I do that won't reach this amount but that amount? My friend owns a TV channel. I will go to him and say, can't you make a program where I look good? Maybe have me invite me to speak on your program. And always think about unintended consequences already. Very brief overview of rules, limits on spending in donations. So Indonesia is the only country today in Southeast Asia that has the limits on donations, but as they are so high, I guess maybe we don't have donation limits in reality. Whereas there are a number of countries that are worth studying if Indonesia continues with the discussion about spending limits. Definitely want you to look at the experience in the Philippines, learning what not to do. The spending limits in the Philippines is too low. Everyone knows it's too low. The Election Commission was saying to Parliament for years, change it. We can't enforce it, because if we enforce it, we'll have to kick everyone out. And that's the same thing like that. Parliament refused to change it, and COMELEC, the Election Commission, did something very interesting, which I will talk about later on. What I would like to do is just give you 60 seconds to think about it, and then see, are there any questions or any comments about the issue of banning or limiting donations to spending? Before we move on, and we will talk more about state funding, reporting, and implementation.
Silakan Bapak Ibu, teman-teman, ada
ada mungkin yang punya pertanyaan untuk Pak Magnus terkait dengan tadi pemaparan beliau tentang sumbangan dan pengeluaran kampanye maupun partai politik. Indonesia memang punya pembatasan sumbangan, tapi kalau kita dilihat dari angkanya, nyaris bukan lagi pembatasan ya, karena tidak ada negara yang beliau pantau yang pembatasannya sampai 1 miliar individu, kalau korporasi 7,5 miliar setinggi negara kita. Termasuk jadi tadi juga soal pembatasan di negara kita, contoh yang saya berikan Tangerang Selatan. Nah itu yang tadi beliau kutip, cenderung juga bukan pembatasan, karena besar sekali angkanya, 17 miliar gitu. Teman-teman ada yang mau bertanya untuk Pak Lu?
Thanks. There's a very articulate explanation on spending bans, why you shouldn't have them too low, and obviously you shouldn't have them too high either, otherwise they're useless. Is there any model in particular, noting that all countries have problems, but is there a model to try and find that balance between a model that's too low and a limit that's too high?
Well, the first thing you need to do is to decide what do you want it for. The main models are either we want it to reduce the current spending level because we think it's too high, or we think that it's unfair to other parties. Well, if that is your goal, you need to find out how much a party is spending today, or we can be spending today. And then in a dialogue with parties find out what can reasonably be done. If you remove it, if you make it too low, they'll simply find ways around. I think it's worth considering quantitative spending limits in the context of limiting other things. So maybe have specific limits on TV advertising. That can be more manageable. But you can also have a donation limit which no one reaches. Sorry, a spending limit that no one reaches. That's okay. If your goal is to make sure that spending doesn't spiral out of control in the future. But the main thing is research on how spending functions today.
Bu Betty dulu, baru Bapak. Boleh ya? Selanjutnya akan
selamat siang. Oke, bahasa Indonesia Mbak Titi.
perkenalan dulu ya Mbak.
Saya Betty, saya anggota KPU Provinsi DKI Jakarta. Topiknya menarik tentang pemasukan dan pengeluaran, tapi khusus untuk Indonesia, kok kayaknya kalau kita membatasi spending akan ada triki lain. Gimana cara ngitungnya? Ada mekanisme cara menghitung untuk donasi yang masuk, dan bagaimana cara juga menghitung untuk donasi yang keluar. Karena kan nggak semuanya tercatat dengan baik, tak terrecord dengan baik. Sekian.
Yeah. That's where it gets. Oh, sorry, actually, it's mine. That's where it gets interesting. Because I would argue later on that the financial reporting by partisan candidates is essential, and it is. But if you set a spending limit, don't expect them to admit to spend. This is something that you have to review by simply following, monitoring. There are some cases, there have been more cases in the last few years where commissions have put their own staff on the ground to try to monitor spending. Serbia did it in 2011, Tunisia did it last year, and a couple of other cases. It's not been proven that that's been very effective. And I can't really see that working in Indonesia. So you would need maybe a few 10 to 100,000 people just go out and monitor campaigns. I'll argue later on that what you need is to get financial reports and publish and make them available to the people. They can help you in checking that. But calculating the level of the spending, you need to do what I mentioned. find out how much spending is today, what could be a reasonable low level. That would be fine. I'd like to add a question. I want to know what do you think should be the rules in Indonesia today? You have election limits that are very high. You don't have spending limits at the national level. Experimenting with it. We don't have elections. Is this something for Indonesia? Or not?
You have question to Pak Magnus and also you will answer the question, right?
Oke, terima kasih Pak Magnus. Nama saya Aditya, saya dosen di Universitas Indonesia. Dari presentasi Anda, saya ingin ada satu hal yang perlu kita diskusikan adalah bagaimana kita mendefinisikan makna dari bans and limits. Apa makna batasan itu sendiri? Itu terkait dengan betapa kami sendiri di Indonesia itu masih punya beberapa problem serius. Yang pertama adalah mungkin nanti teman-teman dari yang NGO bisa menyampaikan bahwa kami kesulitan untuk mengakses political finance dari setiap kandidat dan juga partai politik, yang kemudian batasan dan limit itu sangat abu-abu, yang kemudian ketika diinterpretasikan menjadi sebuah kebijakan ataupun dorongan dari teman-teman NGO ketika menginginkan ada batasan yang high call, yang tinggi, tapi apakah kemudian itu benar-benar dilakukan atau dijalankan oleh partai politik? Jadi yang tadi dikatakan oleh anggota KPU menyebutkan bahwa itu tricky, itu yang terjadi pada kenyataannya, bahwa ketika aturan itu sudah dilakukan, ketika aturan itu sudah ada tentang bagaimana menyebutkan ban sama limit, tapi pada kenyataannya partai politik masih tetap banyak atau kandidat juga tetap masih banyak dengan di luar dari yang proses transfer bank, ya, atau by hand on gitu. Nah itu yang mungkin nanti kalau Pak Ohman juga bisa meriset secara spesifik tentang konteks Indonesia, ada begitu problem-problem yang serius ada di Indonesia, tidak hanya di institusi atau institusi politiknya, tetapi juga di organisasi partai politik dan parlemennya sendiri. Mungkin itu. Terima kasih.
Tapi ya, kalau saya panggilnya Pak dosen hadir, sekaligus si prospek untuk jadi pembimbing saya ya Pak.
Baik, terima kasih. Nama saya Roy Salam dari Indonesia Budget Center. Menarik sekali dari presentasi yang ada di hadapan kita. Pertanyaan saya singkat saja. Apakah ada syarat-syarat yang secara administratif harus dipenuhi oleh kandidat untuk diatur di dalam regulasi atau aturan, sehingga pengawasan dana kampanye baik batasan donasi maupun pengeluaran itu efektif bisa dilakukan? Apakah ada praktek-praktek yang baik di negara lain yang bisa kita contoh? Terima kasih.
First, no point. Well, I wish I could say that this is only Indonesia that has this but most countries do. I think I want to stress that these limits, these bans, can easily increase these problems. Because there are more things that parties and candidates cannot commit to. one effect that we've seen is that when we have spending limits that are quite low, spending moves out of parties and into what we call third parties. So not anyone else. The US has seen a massive increase in this, not so much because of spending limits, which don't exist, but because of transparency criteria. Corporations are not allowed to make donations to election campaigns in the US, and individuals are making a difference. But because of third-party spending through so-called political action committees, PACs, and super PACs, and various PACs, the amount of spending in US elections that we don't know where the money came from is increasing quite dramatically. So always think about how different rules can have an impact. Other countries go completely different routes. Germany, Sanders mentioned as an example. They say basically the people should know where the money is coming from. People should know how it's spent. They have effectively no restrictions. You can do whatever you want as long as it's made public. Is that a good approach for Indonesia? I don't know. That's up for Indonesia to decide. A lot of people feel, well, that we still need to restrict certain things. I completely understand that. But think about how it can be done. The second question, yes, there are a lot of things you can do. Bank cash donations. Require campaign bank accounts. Only allow electronic transactions in and out of accounts. Require that banks automatically give access to oversight bodies for these accounts. Cross-reference these bank accounts with the accounts of donors, with the tax records. It doesn't necessarily work very well if people don't have bank accounts. In a cash economy, where most money is being spent in cash, a lot of money is donated in cash, restrictions like this are not really going to work. They try to require that local government candidates in Afghanistan should have bank accounts. There are no banks outside of the big cities. Certain things, there are a lot of things you can do, but you must think about what is suitable for the country. No country, I guess, with a more advanced banking system than Switzerland. They still found very nice ways around various rules in terms of money laundering and so on. So there's no guarantee in any context. More questions, comments, or ideas about what we should do in this country?
Bapak tadi jadi nanya, sudah cukup atau jadi mau nanya? Bapak kan tadi mau nanya apa sih? Jadi, oh ya.
Baik, terima kasih. Nama saya Magnus dari Pusat Pemilihan Umum Magnus Penyandang Cacat. Jadi mengenai donasi, memang di Indonesia banyak diatur tentang jumlah penerima maupun pengeluaran. Tapi tentu di Indonesia ini bukan saja tidak mentaati aturan, tapi banyakkan menjadi aturan. Sehingga kita tahu pada pemilu yang lalu juga ada relawan nyumbang. Ini kan lucu. Jadi berbagai siasat dari partai politik maupun kandidat ini dilakukan, Pak. Misalkan tentang berbentuk kehendak kampanye. Jadi pihak partai politik maupun calon tidak mengeluarkan anggaran, tapi tim sukses yang tidak masuk rekening membuat spanduk, ribuan spanduk. Jadi susah sekali dilacak. Ini bagaimana? Misalkan undang-undangnya sudah membatasi donasi, ini terlalu besar 1 miliar. Saya kira Indonesia lebih pintar mensiasati. Katakanlah misalkan donasinya satu orang 5.000 saja, tapi dia akan membuat mensiasati relawan akan menyumbang. Padahal nggak tahu sejak kapan ada relawan menyumbang. Kemudian yang kedua, kampanye banyak event di daerah-daerah ini terkadang dan kompanya tidak mengeluarkan anggaran alat peraga karena semuanya dilakukan oleh tim sukses yang tidak masuk dananya ke dana rekening baik kandidat maupun partai politik. Ini yang sangat membahayakan di Indonesia. Bagaimana menurut pembicara agar undang-undang ini efektif baik pengawasannya maupun donasi yang masuk ke partai politik maupun kandidat, karena semacam itulah mohon maaf barangkali kami sedikit menjual moral kita, itulah politikus kita dalam mensiasati undang-undang yang kita buat. Terima kasih.
Well, there are three types of actors that can spend money in elections: parties, candidates, and anyone else. Third would be typical third parties. Start by regulating the first of these. Parties and candidates. One of the regulations I kind of like, which is common in Eastern Europe in some places, is to legally require that campaign materials should list who paid for this. It's also used in North America and some places. A number of countries say if you are producing posters, you actually have to print on the poster the quantity of posters. You don't necessarily tell the truth, but at least you have some data that you can study. That can be useful. Same thing with candidates. Make candidates legally responsible for their campaigns. At least for higher level elections, require that they have a financial agent who together with the candidate is legally responsible. Then we have the very tricky issue of third party involvement. The easiest solution is just ban it. Say if you're not a party or you're not a candidate, you can't be involved in election campaign. But if you're going to do that, it would be seen as unacceptable in many parts of the world. For example, in Europe and in North America, it would be unconstitutional. It's a limitation of freedom of speech. Why should I not be able to say I like this party just because I'm not a candidate or I'm not a candidate? But you can try to regulate it, but it's difficult. Two main options is require that such entities register and are then part of a regulatory framework. So the US system of political action committees, the UK system which is being reformed right now through law saying that you can participate in elections, but you have to follow suit. It's not easy. The other option is to require that candidates or parties report on spending on their behalf or in their favor. So if I'm a candidate, I should report not only on my spending, but what my friends have been spending on my behalf. It's used in Lebanon, it's used in Nigeria, and a few countries. Very good idea, it's very neat, it just doesn't work out. It's completely impossible to do. I mean, how can I know? How can I be legally required to know what someone else does? Especially in Lebanon that has a spending limit. I could make you break the law by putting up posters saying vote for you. I mean, you can't have a principle where you can make someone else break the law without even knowing it. So, but I'd say start by getting some transparency in how parties and candidates spend money. Start there, and then you take it. Should we move on to state funding?
One more question.
Oke, terima kasih. Saya dengan Reza dari perwakilan dari DPP Partai Demokrat. Beberapa kali yang jadi poin pembahasan pada sesi sebelumnya itu kan kita ini ada pembatasan 1 miliar untuk perorangan, 7.500.000 untuk korporasi, tapi itu seperti tidak ada pembatasan karena itu tinggi. bagi Pak Magnus demikian. Tapi kembali lagi ke dasar bahwa kami melihat kalau menurut Pak Magnus itu sudah sangat tinggi, kami bilang tidak cukup tinggi. Kenapa? Karena faktanya berpolitik di Indonesia itu biayanya sangat tinggi. Itu mungkin teman-teman lebih tahu sendiri bagaimana jangankan untuk tingkat nasional, untuk tingkat daerah sendiri, kampanye daerah itu bisa beratus-ratus miliar habisnya. Nah, lantas yang mau saya tanyakan ke Pak Magnus, idealnya untuk Indonesia yang memiliki wilayah yang cukup luas serta kepulauan cukup banyak, idealnya bagaimana sih berpolitik yang baik, berdemokrasi yang baik, penerapannya seperti apa sehingga juga berbiaya rendah. Jadi kita punya uang banyak, kalau memang biayanya tidak perlu kita keluarkan cukup banyak juga nggak apa-apa. Kita bikin batasan-batasan sedemikian rupa, tadi disampaikan oleh kawan kita, udah ada batasannya sedemikian rupa, tapi kalau kebutuhan tinggi, akhirnya adalah kita mensiasati aturan itu, gitu. Jadi itu yang saya tanyakan, idealnya seperti apa? Terima kasih.
Yeah. I guess the most effective ways to reduce the cost of election campaigns is not spending. That can maybe be part of the package, but that in itself is not likely to have a major. Unless you have very strict controls. And they can be easy to time. You can have posters, but they cannot be bigger than A4 and they can only back up. But is that maybe not restricting things a little bit too much? Look at TV advertising. Most countries, most of the money goes to TV. So that would tend to be my first recommendation. You can combine giving access to parties and candidates, free or subsidized access to TV through indirect state funding, which we'll talk about in a second. Organize debates, used in an increasing number of countries between parties and candidates. One way of helping to give parties and candidates a way to get the message out level. And perhaps reducing the allowed amount of advertising. There are different ways. In the Francophone world, you can only put up posters and banners in specifically designated places. That's used in almost all Francophone countries, and they think it's good. Other countries think that's a limitation. But you need to look at not only the amounts, but also the different types of spending. Are there ways we can help to bring that? And one part of that can be the next issue I want to talk about, state funding. A lot of discussion in Indonesia about that. It used to be significantly higher, very significantly reduced. Now there's a big discussion, where should it be? Should it be increased or not? The answer to that is very simple. What are we trying to achieve? How do we want politics in Indonesia to function? Two main purposes of state funding. One can be to try to reduce the difference between parties or candidates that have a lot of money and those that have a little money. Reduce the transparency. But another goal can be to try to ensure that at least all relevant parties or candidates have enough money to make their voices heard, so that the people can make a choice. Which is the most important? That has to be decided in each context. It's very easy to say that we want to do both, which is fine. But each of these purposes have significant implications for how you structure the system. I always argue that if you have state funding or not is less important than how it works. Do it wrong and you're going to make significant harm to the political process. We also need to consider potential downsides with state funding. One is that if our goal is to reduce the difference between rich and poor parties, just giving them all money is not necessarily going to do that. Right? We just move them all up one step. And if we have a fully proportional allocation, like in Indonesia, we are actually going to increase the difference between rich and poor. I'll show you in a second that if you say that the threshold for getting money is very high, well, you may stop new parties from coming in. That's potentially problematic. Especially for new forces, for young people who may be looking towards new forces. There has been limited evidence of this when it's been studied in countries that have been using state funding for a long time. But it's worth looking at. The alternative is that it's very easy to get access to money. You may have people creating parties just to get money, get access to state. And that's not really helpful. One criticism is that it can reduce the connection between parties and the people and their supporters. The parties are not dependent financially on their support. However, that depends on the idea that parties actually are financially dependent on their members. There are one or two cases in the world where that happens. The proportion of party income from membership fees in the Netherlands and in Germany is nearly 30%, but dropping quite dramatically. So those are the only cases I know in the world. In reality, parties rely on one or two out of two sources. State funding in most of Europe, or big donations. From legitimate, good sources or bad sources. The grassroots funding doesn't happen very often. We do see it every now and then. I think there are opportunities for it to become a new thing now with new technology. It's much easier to make a donation now than it used to be. You can do it via an SMS, with a phone app, with various things. So then there are a lot of parties that candidates are trying. But it's not what we're seeing. The biggest problem with state funding is that people don't like it. I think people shouldn't like it. There's something perverse in saying that people should like that tax money is given to political parties. Right? Tax money is things that could be used in hospitals, schools, building roads, at least in Jakarta we need maintenance of roads, and other things. But a responsible government sometimes has to spend money on things that aren't immediately popular. It's not popular to spend money on elections. We obviously do. And maybe the advantages of spending some state funding on political parties can outweigh the negative. I think the key message needs to be from the people that if the political parties want to increase state funding. And of course it would be the parties doing that. The parties are in Parliament, Parliament passes laws. It needs to be combined with other measures, showing the commitment of the parties to transparency. So more detailed reporting, clear legal mandates to an oversight body, more about oversight, more resources to the oversight, clear sanctions. The party that doesn't submit its financial reports shouldn't get any state funding. So it's not just one thing. Okay. Just over 2/3 more countries in the world use direct state funding and giving money to parties. But in many of these countries, the money being given is very, very small. It's used in over 60% of African countries, but outside of South Africa and Mozambique, I don't think it makes any difference to parties anywhere. The situation is very different in Europe. Most countries, 60, 70, 80, 90% of party income comes from the state. European average now is somewhere around 65%. But I mentioned earlier this issue about indirect state. Given parties, potentially candidates, access to the media. It can be free access to state media, publicly owned media. You can also require that private media outlets give free or subsidized access to party candidates through licensing agreements between the state and media outlets. You can also have other forms of indirect public funding. One that I really like is tax relief. If you say that any donations up to this amount, you can deduct from your taxes. It has two advantages. One is that it encourages small donations. If we say that it's only up to this level, after that you don't get any tax. The second advantage, which is very important if you're working for the state oversight body, is that it creates an incentive for people to actually report on their donations. If they don't report about their donation, they don't get the tax. There's one problem. It only works if people actually pay tax.
Yep.
If they don't pay their taxes, obviously they won't be reporting anything. They don't want to draw attention to themselves and don't want to get a visit from the tax authorities. So in many countries in the world, it doesn't actually. Two issues that we must address in talking about state funding. The first is who should get access to this money? And let's talk about political parties now. So in Indonesia, it's very straightforward. If you have an elected seat, you get access to the money. But not if you don't. This can be a problem for new political parties because they're trying to get into parliament, but they can't get access to state funding until they do. Many countries use another threshold. The most common is to say that you, the party, must get a certain percentage of the vote. Global average being 3.6, that doesn't matter. To get access to state funding, at least some of the state funding. How much you get, that's the next. Sometimes there are some countries that have no restrictions. Something you can shift more close to home. Maldives don't have voting threshold. One problem can be that, as I mentioned before, parties are created just to get access to the state funding. This is a trick sometimes used by governments too. I think it was Gabon in the late 90s, late 80s, they said, any party that's created will get $40,000 and a 4x4 car. Great idea, because suddenly have thousands of parties. The opposition could not merge, they could not come together, they could not create an effective force. And the government won the day. On the other hand, down here, it can become very problematic for parties to get access to state funding. Zimbabwe had 15%. The Supreme Court said, no, that's too much. You have to lower it. They lowered it to 5%. The way it works, it's still only parties that are now in a government coalition that's been able to reach that. So no opposition parties are receiving state funding, even though they are 61. That's automatic. Which of this is the right level? Depends on what you're trying to achieve. But I think it might be worth considering if parties that nearly reach elected seats should maybe have access to at least some state. Where I'm from, if the party loses all their seats, they continue to get a small amount of state funding until the next election. The idea being that to help them show why we should come back. It's fine. The next thing you need to think about is, once we've established which parties that should have access to this money, how do we allocate it? How much should each party get? There are two very straightforward answers. I say, make it fully dependent on proven support of each political party. So make it 100% proportional. You can see a number of countries, including Indonesia, is using that approach. It's easy to calculate, and it respects the will of the people. Now, the problem is that it needs to give most money to the biggest parties. They aren't necessarily the ones that need the money the most. More than 2/3 of public funding, state funding in South Africa goes to the ANC. They don't need it. The other approach is to say, well, everyone should have the same. If any party reaches the threshold, give them the same amount. It's very equal, it's very fair, it's very nice. And a number of countries is using it. The US is there because all the parties get very small support to the nomination conventions. Then you can forget it. And in Indonesia, I've heard this argument in relation to the fact that there are certain costs connected to being a party, which is you have to have a certain number of offices in a lot of different places. Those requirements are the same for all parties, depending on how big they are. Therefore, it's logical that they should have all parties should have the same. There are some problems with that approach as well. One is that it ignores what the people think by giving this party, which is so tiny, the same amount of this party, which people really want. I think more problematic, perhaps, is that it's a waste of money. Especially where you have a lot of parties, you're going to give money, perhaps significant amounts of money, to parties that don't really make any difference. In Nigeria, there was a court ruling, and I'm sorry for using a lot of African examples, so why not? That it was unconstitutional to give money in proportion to votes. The response by Parliament was they completely removed the state. Because if you have to give an amount that matters to all their 68 parties, it would just cost them. So what many countries do is that they combine these two. They give a certain portion of the money equally to all parties that are eligible, and they give the rest of the money portion. Normally in proportion to the vote, sometimes in proportion to the seats of parties. In a proportional electoral system, that is pretty much the same thing. But it can be a big difference if you have American or UK single donor districts. Sometimes in relation to the number of candidates. There are other options too. One is the matching funds. It's used in Germany and it's used in certain areas in the US, in New York, for example. What it means is that if you can raise a certain amount privately, the state will match that, either the same amount or a lower or a higher. So it encourages parties to engage in fundraising. That can be valuable, but only if you set a limit for the size of donations that come up. There's no point in saying if you get $1 trillion rupiah, we're going to give you $1 trillion from the state. That's not There is an issue, there's a discussion in Indonesia about if we should earmark state funding. I understand there's a recommendation, although not legally binding, that percentage of the funds today should be used for public education, or political education, sorry. Just mention most countries don't earmark the state funds, which is basically then saying you have to use the money for this or that. Some of them have rules that a certain portion of the money has to be used. Just showing some of the figures to break down what I've been showing, and I will be all distributed shares, all this information that you As I mentioned, over 2/3 of countries provide state funding. I have never been able to figure out what this is. Why in particular South Asia don't have this type of regulations. India has been experimenting back and forth with the state funding. It's interesting to follow the discussion in India, but they've not reached a conclusion on where they want to be. This is the situation currently in Southeast Asia. So we have regular, although low, level of state funding today in Indonesia. We also have it in Thailand and East Timor. The law in Cambodia says that there can be state funding, but in practice no money has been distributed. I should also mention that apart from the threshold that I mentioned earlier, a number of countries, an increasing number of countries, uses disqualification criteria. So they say that you will not get any funding, or you will get less funding if you don't fulfill certain things. A number of countries says that if you don't have a certain share of women among your candidates, you will get less money. This was championed by France in 1998, and basically says that in the current law, if the gap between men and women is more than 2%, you'll lose 3/4 of what the gap is. The problem is that France is a French. It's a chauvinistic country. The political parties have happily forfeited billions of euros because they don't want to nominate women. So they lose quite substantial amounts of state funding because they want to nominate men. I also mentioned, which I really think should be a criteria, which is if the parties don't fulfill these commitments in terms of submitting financial reports and so on, they shouldn't get any money. The last issue I wanted to address before we go to a discussion and question and comments, and I think take a little break, is the issue of financial reporting. So I made the point, I hope, that there is no point in having regulations unless you have them. Brief overview of how it works. Who should be submitting reports? Well, ideally political parties and candidates at a minimum. There are a number of countries where only one of these submit reports. Most of those systems have significant problems with transparency, because it means that money will just go through whoever doesn't have to. You can also have reporting requirements for others. Some countries require media outlets, TV stations, that sell advertising time to parts of candidates to submit separate financial reports to the oversight. That may be a good idea in some cases, because it provides a parallel information flow that you use. Some countries require banks to submit reports about the bank accounts, especially depending on the banking system. What information should be in this? I'll come to that in a second. Who do they report to? Well, some cases say they have to publish this information in national newspaper. That's nonsense. They will say, in the newspaper saying, we spent 5 billion on TV advertising, 2 billion on leaflets. What am I supposed to do with that? I have no chance of checking it as accurate. We can only use information if we have it in a reasonable level of detail. A reasonable level of detail can only be accessible in one format. That's on the other. It is great to have it on paper and you can look at it and you can read it, that's fine. You can't make it useful. So some countries require the candidates to publish their accounts on the internet themselves. I think often more useful is when they report it to some kind of state body. What are we trying to achieve? Well, the overall goal is better informed voters. The voters themselves will normally not access this information. It's quite common. It's only if you're interested in these kind of things that you can really understand how it works. So we need media, we need civil society to get this information, use it, analyze it, understand it, and present it to people in a way that makes sense. Also, other politicians can use this information. That works in some cases, it doesn't work everywhere. In the long run, we want to have an increased public confidence in politicians, in political parties, in the market. In reality, what we tend to see when rules like this are introduced, strengthened, is the confidence goes down. Because people find out about all the naughty things that politicians do. But that's, we hope, is short term. What we're trying to achieve is that in the longer term, people are studying this information, they're studying the behavior of people, politicians in particular, and confidence will grow in time. And the scandal here is a very interesting issue. Political finance scandal means two things. First, someone has done something bad, unless it's a lie. The second is that someone has been able to find out and report about it. The third thing, people actually care. And absence of scandal can mean either that nothing is happening, but it can also happen that no one is allowed to find out, no one is allowed to tell. Scandals for me is a good thing. It means that something at least is working. As long as we can get people to get upset about it. We want to reach a stage where there are no scandals and people feel confident that that's because someone is looking at it, they're actually not doing anything. So, among the information we want to have is what are the assets, what are the liabilities of political parties, what are the candidates. If you own a lot of stocks in a company, it's very useful for us to know, because if you later on you become the Ministry of Agriculture, and that company that you happen to own 20% of, so they get a lot of contracts. That's very useful for us to know. We want to know the income, obviously, but also income in kind. Income that's not in money. Ideally, we want to know where did the money come from. This is a very complicated issue. Politicians will say, if we have to report who gave us the money, no one will want to give us money. Especially opposition parties, I'm not talking about Indonesia, I'm talking about generally, will say that we, the opposition, has to report who gave us money. Our supporters will get targeted by police, by tax authorities, by so on. Sometimes there is a lot of credence to such arguments. Sometimes they make sense. Sometimes such arguments are made because they don't want people to find out who gave them the money. The most common solution to this type of problems is that you set a threshold for when we report the identity. If you give a small amount of money, that's fine. You don't have to report. In some cases, if it's above this, you have to report it, but we're not going to make information about it. But if you make very large donations, the right of the people to know where the money came from is arguably more important than the right for you to make a donation. And we want to know where the spending is coming. The vast majority of countries in the world have reporting requirements for political parties, for candidates, even though it varies. Sometimes it's dependent on the entire electoral system. You can just see how it is most possible. I want to talk about enforcement. To be honest, I think maybe we should wait with that until we've had a discussion and a bit of a break. It's quite warm. But the two things I've spoken about now is state funding and the issue of financial aid. Are there any questions or comments about that in the Indonesian or in the international?
Silakan, Mas Umum. Saya mau tanya tadi soal penjelasan Pak Ohman tentang subsidi negara untuk partai politik. Kalau di kita ya, bantuan keuangan untuk partai politik, pelaporan dan juga bagaimana pengawasan. Ada yang ingin berkomentar? Pak Pos? Sudah lihat? Belum. Oke, dia. Ada lagi teman-teman yang lain? Oh, Pak Luk lagi. Gak apa-apa Pak Luk, mumpung kita punya Pak Magnus ya, kapan-kapan lagi kita punya dia. Silakan Ian dulu, and then Pak Paul.
It's very interesting when you say about disclosure and the reporting from the private sector. For example, I know I heard from a friend that Philippines, they actually creating an application. So they try to create an application that can connect the member of parliament with the private sectors. So in case the private sectors are interested to fund them in their next campaign, they can register through that application, and then they can communicate, and it can create some kind of transparency, but also it can create a healthier way to fund public official, for example, for candidacy. I don't know whether it works or not, but I know I want to ask whether you have heard something like that before. And actually, I also want to know about the public disclosure for the private sector donations in other country, whether it's really works or it's not that.
Thanks. After following these issues for a few years here, I'm absolutely convinced that Indonesia needs a significant increase in public funding for political parties, but I just don't know how civil society and reformers within those parties can communicate that to a very, very sceptical public. And you mentioned that that's kind of healthy to have that skepticism, but have you come across any examples where that reform has happened and has been communicated effectively?
First on the issue of reporting of private donations. It works better in some countries than in others. It helps not to have any limits. There are no donation limits in the United Kingdom, for example. And bodies happily report donations of £500,000, £1 million, a couple of billion rupees, because it's allowed, so why not? It also depends on the climate of the country. But it doesn't work well where there are limits and people want to give more money than the limit, because then they will need to find some other way of doing it. And it certainly doesn't work where the risk of harassment is real. That is the case. There's also the issue where people own the parties. Right? There's one person, and this is his party. There's some discussion about that in Indonesia, but it's worse in other places. In many countries I go to, I ask, what are the name of these parties, and no one can remember. It's his party, Mr. So-and-so. What's the name? I don't know, it doesn't matter. It's his party. Right? In those cases, it becomes very problematic, because often it's funded specifically from this individual. Again, if you can get transparency for that, then that's fine. State funding. I think in an Indonesian context, the way forward is what I mentioned about combining an increase in state funding with significant increases in disclosure rules, oversight, to a lesser extent sanctions. I don't generally believe that formal sanctions is really going to help with that. There's not little evidence for that around. But if we say we really need to know where the information came from, it really has to be reported, we will look at it, and we will make it public. Doing that, it has to be realistic. I understand that the reporting deadline after an election, a national election, now is 15 days. That's not possible. Ask any politician in the country who's working with financial management, and they will tell you very why it's impossible for them to collect that amount of data even if they don't review it and provide it to an oversight. The oversight body then has a certain number of days to hand it over to an auditor. Okay, that's not really an issue. The auditor has, I think, 2 weeks to look at it. That's impossible. No one can look at financial accounts within that short time. To be honest, well, why should they? The important thing is to make the day the information comes to the oversight body, it's made public. For me, that's the first step. Then you need a number of months to look at it. That means that the review of campaign finance reports won't be done by the time that Parliament is sworn. That's a shame. There's nothing you can do about it. It takes that amount. I have not had a chance to discuss statutory limitations in English. A number of countries have problems saying that the law says that we can only sanction someone if we find out or prosecute an activity within a certain period after it happened. Statutory limitations are fine. They make sense because we want to make sure that the police and prosecutors work on cases that are relevant. But if those statutory limitations are measured in months, a few months, sometimes less than a month, it becomes impossible. By the time we find out that this politician committed a crime in the election campaign, there's nothing we can do. Parliamentary immunity is another issue. Should a parliamentarian have immunity? I have a discussion with parliamentarians from different countries. They said, why should we, parliamentarians said, we should not have immunity. We commit a crime, we should go to prison just like anyone else. You can make an argument for immunity though, if there is a risk that parliamentarians get targeted by the judiciary. I would argue that crimes related to how you became a parliamentarian, to how you acquire that, should be exempted from parliament. That's my point. So, the answer to your question is, make sure you combine all these things, make it credible message. Have a body, be it an existing body or a new body or a combination or whatever, saying we are going to make sure that they are following. I'll have my people go there after the elections, hand out more food, money, whatever it is. If they voted for someone else, I won't give them anything, and if I'm elected, I'll make sure that they don't get any development. This is what I would do, and in fact this is what is done in a lot of parts of the world. We tend to see this in particular where we have structures that can be used through village heads, or the local priest, or the local imam, or someone who I can use as a corrupt politician to help me do this. In a number of countries there are semi-professional fixers that work in between candidates and people in the village. And often this works less well in urban areas. There we tend to have more of this because I have to deal with individual voters. So I do urge you to consider the issue. Does vote buying exist in Indonesia? Well, I've been informed that it does. But how does it? We can't try to stop it unless and until we know how. Right? How do we stop vote buying? It's very difficult. We can put up posters saying vote buying is bad. That's not only ineffective, it's also a little bit patronizing towards people. I find in general that people are quite well informed when they are selling their vote. I know I'm not getting out of this. It's been 4 years since the last election. I've not seen any development in that period. My family has not benefited. Here come some politicians and they want to give me the money for this election. I make the choice of giving them, receiving that money, and maybe or maybe not voting for this. It's not illogical. unfortunately, is very bad for democracy. Almost all countries, effectively all countries in the world, have a ban on vote buying. Normally it says you're not allowed to give things in return for votes, or promise things in return for votes. There is a complementary regulation which I think can help, which is to say that if you're a candidate or in a party, you're not allowed to give money. It doesn't matter what your intent is. But you are officially banned from giving anything before an election. The advantage is that in a court of law you don't have to prove intent. You can have a little bit of an advantage. The important question to ask is, should it be legal to sell your vote? In other words, to receive money. It's logical that it should be. In all other corruption cases, and this is corruption, make no mistake, it's illegal to give a bribe and it's illegal to receive it. However, we find that reporting that vote buying is taking place is often very much harmed by it being illegal to receive money. Because if I report to the authorities that I received vote buying, well, I'm admitting to a crime. Or if I'm reporting that my neighbor or my family member received money, I'm accusing them of a crime. So some countries have made sure that buying a vote is illegal, receiving it, the money, selling a vote is not. Mongolia has a rule that if you report vote buying, you report that I received 1,000, whatever it is, and it's proven, I get extra money from the state. I get rewarded for reporting vote buying. That money is taken from the political party that did the money. I don't think it works, probably, but I like the idea, and innovative thinking. Guaranteeing the secrecy of the vote is incredibly important. It's a key democratic principle. It can help. It helps against that first type of transactional vote buying. And then we need to get around things like people taking their mobile phones into polling stations, taking photos of their ballot paper and so on. But note that that has no impact on that second type of vote buying, where I, as a corrupt candidate, only need to know how the polling station voted, or the village voted. So it doesn't take you all. In practice, vote buying goes away when people are no longer responding to it. Every politician, even if I'm corrupt, I don't want to buy votes because there's money. Money that I can keep or I can use for something else. And if people are not responding to it, then it will go away. That's the long-term solution. That's where we want to end up. There are some countries, there are some older democracies where vote buying doesn't really happen. Normally, it has very little to do with formal laws. It has to do with the voters not responding to the effects of vote buying. This closely relates to this second topic I wanted to address before we go into oversight by public and bodies and society, which is abuse of state resources. Sometimes called unmanageable resources, sometimes called other. Basically, using the things, the money, people, the staff, vehicles, media belonging to the state to campaign for a certain party. There's a grey zone. I mean, all incumbent politicians use their position in one way or another. That's how it goes. If I'm the president, well, everyone knows I have name recognition. I have the power of incumbents, the advantage of incumbents. Maybe that's okay, because you also have the disadvantage of incumbents. You will be blamed for anything that happens. And a lot of politicians, when the global financial crisis hit in 2008, a lot of politicians lost their seats. Things that had nothing to do with them. But that's very different from when you are using the resources of the state to ensure that your party or you as a candidate, as a politician, continue to stay in power. And there are a number of examples of this. Money simply being given to a party or a candidate from a ministry or what have you. Less common, I think. Much more if you have a significant increase of pensions or salaries of state staff. That's very useful. You say not to give tips. IFRS has handbook, training and detection and enforcement, nearly done with the Indonesian translation. Chapter 16 lists 100 ways to abuse state resources, with practical examples from countries around the world. I don't remember if we had any from Indonesia. My favorite is temporary employment schemes. Great. You hire a number of people for a couple of months before the elections. They don't have to do anything, that's not the point. You give them some money. They will like you, they will vote for your party. And after the elections, you fire them. Very easy. Very different from permanent employment schemes, which is governed by very different rules. What can we do about this? Well, the point is that the state and the political parties is not the same thing. Even if one party has controlled the state for a very long time. This is from Copenhagen. We generally want to ban, say, state entities cannot favor any political party. That's fine, but that's the first step. Increasingly common is this, to say that you're not allowed to do certain things before an election. India has new legislation which says that X number of months before an election, you cannot hire new staff, you cannot start new programs, you cannot do this or that, unless you have approval of the election commission. If there's an emergency, you can get an approval from the election commission, which will publish your letter from the ministry and their response on this letter. You may know that Bangladesh had a system where 1 year before every election the government had to resign. They actually had a temporary government for 1 year before each election. Their only job was to organize it. Unfortunately, it meant that the people of Bangladesh didn't have an elected government for 1 year after before. The system is no longer in place. But again, the idea is limited. And of course, you will ban political parties now as from receiving these types of things. However, there is little evidence that laws actually help in this field. It's a little bit similar to the mobile. What we need to get is for people not to respond to these type of activities. In my country, with all the problem that it has, if a party in government tries to increase pensions before an election, they will lose the election. They will be accused of using state resources. And this is where civil society has an incredibly important role. Ensuring that the resources of the state are used in the interest of the Indonesian people. And that brings me to the main topic, the final topic, which is how to enforce regulations. Regulations won't take us anywhere on their own. Very often they are too vague to actually be enforced. And this can also apply if we have significant gaps in the legislation. Cambodia has detailed rules about candidates, what they can do and not do, but it doesn't actually have reporting requirements. So we will never know if they follow these rules. Many countries trying to get away from that problem end up on the other side. They have rules that are too complicated to actually be enforced. And related to that is having rules that are too restrictive. We already mentioned this case of having to, you get money locally, have the senator of Jakarta get it back and then spend it again. That's too restrictive. The regulation by the Election Commission in Bhutan at least seems to indicate that if a candidate wants to put something on his Twitter account or on his Facebook page, he has to get it approved by the Election Commission. Way too complicated. I actually think the Election Commission in Bhutan doesn't know what Facebook is. So more problematic, more common, is that the rules aren't that bad. To be honest, the rules in many countries aren't all that bad. But they haven't thought about how we're going to implement it. Myanmar has candidate finance reporting system. Quite impressive for such a new country in election terms. They even have a requirement that these reports have to be published on a local level. But they didn't put in place a structure for what anyone should do if they find a mistake in these rules. So it just ends, if you find something wrong, well, it's tough luck. And there's no one to listen to. Incredibly damaging to democracy is we end up with a system where rules are being implemented, but implemented against a certain party or a certain candidate. When US civil society groups think about what rules should be in place, what powers should be given to the commission, to whatever body, think about what happens if they abuse those powers. And not just today, I'm sure we have very nice commissioners in whatever body we are thinking about, but maybe those won't be the people in charge next time. I had a very scary experience working in a former Soviet country where civil society supported a much stronger mandate for the oversight body. It was moved from the Election Commission to someone else, and they immediately used it to start targeting the opposition. Really, really scary. Underlying this is a lack of political will. In a democracy, laws are passed by politicians. That's what democracy means. After. It also means they have to regulate themselves. And that's complicated. So what can we do? Well, part of it is the formal oversight. I'm going to talk about this very briefly because I want to talk more about civil society. Different countries in the world use different types of bodies to oversee political finance. The most common tends to be the election management body. I should mention just that in this table, both KPU and Bavaslu would be counted as an election management body. But then you can have other options. You can have a state audit body. You can have an anti-corruption body. You can have a court, like the Latin American countries. You can have a specific body. A number of countries have a specific body for party oversight, sometimes specifically for public finance oversight. France, for example. You can have a ministry that does this type of body. It's very clear that there is no best type of body to do this. It just doesn't seem to be all that important. What is important is that the body has enough clear legal mandate. And it shouldn't be voluntary for this institution. It should be part of what they have to do as a state. They then have to have the resources, which is the money, power, the expertise to do this. They have to have the perceived and real independence. It's not enough that they are actually independent, people must also have trust. Then there's one more thing, because I work with a lot of election commissions which have all of these things, but they still don't succeed because they don't have the political will. They don't want to get engaged in these issues. And I have full understanding for that reason. If I'm a completely professional election commission in particular, I run elections perfectly, they're administered perfectly, And then someone comes, oh yeah, you should do this very politically sensitive issue. So then the Commission says, no, ignore that. So the body has to be willing to get their hands dirty as well. Because political finance is political. But formal oversight, as essential as it is, doesn't take us far enough. We need formal regulation that's enforced by a body or several bodies. But we also need media to pay attention to these issues, and we need civil society to be very active. There are no cases where effective oversight and transparency has come without these things. So what's the role of civil society? Well, effectively three things. The first thing is to use the financial reports submitted by parties and candidates and say, are they accurate? There's no formal government body in the world that reviews all reports. The Federal Election Commission in the US looks at a fraction of the reports. Anything else is impossible. What they do is that they publish them and then ask people to report inaccuracies. I spoke to a guy from the Commission in Finland, and he was asked, how do you check if the reports are accurate? And his response was, we rely on the public and the media. I think that's fairly straightforward. In practice, that's how it works. You have essential responsibility. But it requires that you actually have a report. If reports are submitted that they stay with the Commission, that's impossible. That's the first step. You also have to monitor the government body, the public body that does the oversight. That's KPU or Barbasloo or anything else. Civil society has a role of monitoring that this body does its job. Are violations actually being sanctioned? And very importantly, the last one, is there bias against any particular party or in favor of any party? In doing this, you also need to realize that whatever public body is in charge will have significant limitations. There's no point in keep saying this body is not doing its job. This body is not doing its job. Why is it not doing it? Is it doesn't have the resources, doesn't have the legal will, the political will, they're actually being influenced by certain parties, and how can that be changed? Sometimes you can change things by moving it from one body to another, but that doesn't necessarily have anything. You can't move it from there to there, it's always fine. In doing that, you have to think, does this body have the right resources, the right mandate, the right thinking and so on? So that's essential. And generally think of the oversight body as a partner, although a partner that you are critically studying. The last thing, and one issue that I deal with a lot when working with civil society groups around the world, is to actually monitor the use of money in elections. If you've been working with election observation in general, you may have done parallel vote counts, quick counts. You have the votes are counted here, and then it's reported, and you do your own parallel system. This is a similar idea. There is financial reporting by the parties and candidates. You do your own monitoring, and then you compare it. It's difficult. It takes time. It takes resources. It takes skills. But it's doable. So you select certain parties, certain areas, certain elections, certain times, and you go in and scrutinize. Record all the TV broadcasts and say how many seconds of TV advertising is this happening. and how much to support. I have people right now counting billboards in Dnipropetrovsk in Ukraine. I'm helping and counting how much is that worth. And comparing that with the official resource. So it's very important to do this in relation to election campaigns. But then the problem is that once the election campaigns are over, very often we forget about it. Okay, we did this, done that, campaign finance over. But this is an ongoing process. So let's look at our politicians. When we get public contracts, who gets the public contracts? Is there a connection between the companies getting contracts and the politicians or their brothers? Remember that this is continuous from election to election. And very often returning the favor of the money that party or candidate got during the election campaign may happen a year after the election, it may happen 2 years after. So it has to be ongoing. So overall, what is the role of civil society? Well, the main thing we can't do without is to build awareness about why this is an important issue. Generally, that isn't so much of a problem. In one sense, when we look at survey data from around the world, people are aware of there being corruption, and they're very upset about corruption. The problem is more to make them really care about it than to believe that something can be done about it. It's not awareness in the sense of, oh yeah, corruption is bad, but oh yeah, it's really bad. We have to do something. That's normally the importance. So building caring perhaps is better than awareness. I think there's a very interesting momentum in Indonesia today in working with the legislation that we have. That work needs to continue and to reach a point where we have a coherent structure for political party and candidate finance legislation. Maybe it should be in a specific political finance law, maybe it should be in an omnibus election law, maybe it should be in different laws. That matters less than that there is coherence. And then also explaining why different reforms are evident. I think the issue of state funding is particularly important. We don't have state funding in Indonesia today. I mean, the amounts provided, as we talked about, have nothing to do with that. And especially with the legal requirements to even be a party, which will cost a lot of money, it seems reasonable. I've heard a number of people say state funding is needed. I bow to that judgment. The question is, how do we then get to the point where this is accepted? We don't have to get the political parties to accept it, so I think therefore we will, but to get the people to accept it. And I've already explained, I think we need to combine with more of this. I also mentioned scandals before. Scandals are very useful in one sense, in the way they show the health of the system, because people are allowed to find out and do care about corruption. Corruption scandals is a very common driving force behind reform. The Federal Election Commission in the United States was created as a response partly to the Watergate scandal. You also should be aware that scandals is not necessarily, if it's effective to create reform, it doesn't necessarily create very good reforms. Because often the response and the reform is specifically related to whatever the scandal happened to be at the time. And it does not necessarily amount to a coherent view of what needs to be done. So It's not the one thing that we should wait for and work on. I already mentioned, well, first make sure that the reports are made available and then do analyze them. There are a number of civil society groups from the US to Kenya that use these reports, analyze them and publish the information in a way that people can understand. That makes sense to me. I want to be able to go in and search, has so-and-so made a donation to any candidate at any time. If I can't do that, I don't consider that I have the data available in the format that I want. And related to the monitoring that I was talking about, make sure that there is independent information. Until and unless political finance reports in Indonesia are made available to the public, the only thing available would be your monitoring. If you go out and find information that this is how much was spent on whatever it is, that would be the only information available. And you can then use that as advocacy to say, we know that there are problems with our data, but we can't, no one shows us the real data, i.e. the data from the political parties. As a necessary form. There are many issues to be addressed. Should civil society be holding out certain political parties that are especially transparent as good examples? I think that can be very valuable in the sense of rewarding the parties and candidates that do their best to be transparent. The risk is that you, as a civil society group, will be accused of being biased. That's pretty automatic. There's also the risk that that particular party that you held up will turn out to be corrupt afterwards, and then you get targeted. In general, what you do in terms of putting out information, or if you're accusing a certain candidate of breaking the law, you may open yourself for being sued. Not nice. Some civil society groups do these type of activities on a very generalized basis. They may say, we have found that X number of candidates or parties broke the law, but we're not going to tell you who. That's a shame. I mean, that means we are missing important information. But in situations where legal issues, there may be security issues, I worked with a civil society group in the elections in Afghanistan. They found that a number of candidates had broken the law, and they reported that. But they didn't mention which these candidates were, knowing that they may be targeted by their violence. So, many issues that need to be considered. What is the best approach in civil society, for civil society? You should come together and work as one, while at the same time you don't have to agree with each other, because there are many different views to be taken. So, some kind of unified platform without trying to get everyone on the same page, I think is very important. Okay, before we go to questions and comments, I want to leave you with this last bit. This was now a few years ago. A number of organizations that have been working with political finance support around the world for many decades trying to come up with some key understandings of the problem. The first is that parties and candidates need money. And this is where I started there. You can't remove money from politics because they will remove parties. Secondly, we've been unable to find any country on the planet where money is not a problematic part of politics. Everywhere. Thirdly, the context of each country is essential. That's true for many things. but political finance is inherently political. So we need to adjust it to what is the case here. Also means that the context in Indonesia today is not the context in Indonesia 3 years ago. Things are going to change. When you put in new rules, people will respond to those rules. The good news is that effective and regulation and disclosure, financial reporting can help to reduce the negative aspects of money in politics. But only if these rules are suitable, only if they are well implemented. And finally, you cannot have effective control of political finance without all relevant stakeholders. That includes government bodies, that includes civil society, media, and it includes the political parties and candidates themselves. I don't want to come out of this sounding like the political parties and the candidates are the enemy. Without engaging with them, this is impossible. They are part of the problem and part of the solution. Thank you.
Luar biasa Pak Magnus, satu buku yang hijau tadi, konklusinya 5 poin di sini ya. Jadi kita sudah ibarat baca buku political finance. Jadi saya bicara ya Pak ini. Teman-teman ada yang masih mau bertanya dengan Pak Ohman soal beberapa hal yang disampaikan? Iya, Pak Pasha. Mas tadi mau nanya? Pak dosen Mbak Yolanda. Silakan Pak. Oh iya, saya ini pegang.
Terima kasih. Saya kira tidak usah memperkenalkan begitu ya, sudah kenal ini Magnus dari Pusat Pengembangan Akses Pendidikan Disabilitas. Jadi masalah money politik di Indonesia itu sudah menjadi penyakit akut di Indonesia. Tapi yang jadi masalah, saya ingin tanyakan ke narasumber, mana yang akan ditangani? Karena ini berdasarkan penelitian kami ini semacam lingkaran setan. Jadi pertama, kandidat dari partai politik berpikir kalau tidak melakukan money politik akan kalah, karena calon lain banyak melakukan money politik. Masyarakat berpikir kalau kami tidak menerima uang dari partai politik, maka setelah jadi pun sama, tidak ada perubahan. Jadi kedua sisi ini saling berpikir negatif. Kalau masyarakat tidak menerima uang dari peserta partai politik, kalau jadi pun biasa-biasa saja, tidak memberi perubahan kepada kami. Partai politik calon berpikir kalau kami tidak ikut money politik kepada pemilih, maka kami kalah. Karena calon-calon lain pun banyak melakukan money politik. Regulasi di Indonesia sebenarnya cukup bagus tentang money politik. Tapi terus terang saja, sepanjang ini belum ada calon maupun peserta partai politik yang tidak digugurkan karena terbukti melakukan money politik. Ini permasalahan yang sangat mendasar bagi kita NGO tentang pemiluan. Walaupun kenyataannya berkeliaran di mana-mana money politik, tapi ini adalah barang siluman, susah dibuktikan. Sehingga sepanjang pengetahuan saya, jarang sekali apakah kepala daerah atau legislatif yang digugurkan kemenangannya karena terbukti melakukan money politik. Jadi intinya mana dulu yang perlu kami advokasi, karena dua ini menjadi lingkaran setan. Apakah kita advokasi dulu partai politiknya agar dia sadar tidak boleh melakukan money politik, atau masyarakatnya dulu agar dia tidak mau menerima money politik dari partai politik. Itu saja. Terima kasih.
Thank you, Dr. Ohman, for your presentation. I'm Yolanda from the University of Indonesia. For the upcoming revision of the election law, we've been trying to come up with a recommendation which will relate an increased amount of the state funding with the effort to pressure political parties to improve their internal mechanism of selecting candidates, especially for female candidates. Based on your experience, to what extent or in what forms do other countries succeed in implementing this kind of regulations? Thank you.
Terakhir ya, ya, maksudnya untuk sesi ini. One more ya, Pak Ohman.
Terakhir, Mas. Saya mungkin ada hal yang lebih sebelumnya mungkin mengenai hambatan atau mengapa iuran atau tren saat ini bahwa iuran anggota itu tidak menjadi sustain, tidak lestari. Jadi sehingga kita sekarang mulai mendiskusikan tentang state funding. Karena kalau ini saya kabarkan ke teman-teman ada menjatuhkan mental gitu. Karena saat ini teman-teman sedang membangun iuran, lagi memulai iuran. Nah, yang bisa Anda nasihati pada kami atau saya meminta pendapat Anda adalah apa sih yang membuat anggota kemudian berhenti membangun? Karena kalau dari kami sekarang ini sedang membangun iuran member untuk partai hijau Indonesia. Tapi apa sih yang kemudian, ini lagi semangat-semangatnya ya, nah apa sih yang kemudian di tren di negara-negara atau kemudian dia berhenti dan anggota nggak mau lagi menyumbang? Apa hambatan yang paling nyatanya? Itu aja.
It is a vicious cycle in many countries. The issue of negative thinking and the idea that if everyone else does it, I have to do it too, I think is very, very important. And unless we break that, we're not really going to get anywhere. There's no one approach to doing that. We would need a combination of factors. I think improved legislation is necessary. I think improved oversight is absolute. Without that, forget about it. We don't have a body in Indonesia today, I understand, that has a clear mandate to deal with these issues, that has the resources to do so. Working with civil society, the issues that I was talking about a little while ago, and working with the people, as you said, try to change the expectations is essential. Don't say vote buying is bad. Go in a dialogue with people. Why are you receiving the money even if during an election campaign? What is the alternative? Is there a way we can get out of that cycle? And work with politicians. How can they be rewarded for good behavior? I think that is an essential factor. And also, how can we reduce costs of election campaigns? There's no politician in the world who wants to spend a lot of money on election campaigns. That's not what they want to do. They want to get elected. If we can work to some extent to reduce the money you need to win elections, it can help to reduce the focus on money. I've been writing about the issue of political finance and gender. And especially political finance regulations and gender equality in elections, and the issue of state funding and gender equality. It's now about 20 countries around the world, not 10%, it's not bad, that have a legal connection between these issues. Does it increase gender equality? The answer is very clear, no. In most of the cases, the rules are too new. They've only been used for a couple of elections, and we must expect this to take several cycles to come. But I think it's a very interesting approach. It can be a complement to quotas. It can sometimes be an alternative to quotas. If quotas for some reason is not acceptable. It leaves things open for parties in a way that quotas doesn't. But it's right. My thinking is that 3 criteria must be fulfilled for this quota. A, parties must rely on state funding as a significant part of their income. If you introduce gender criteria for the state funding of the current state funding of parties in Indonesia, it's not going to make any difference. It's so small number. It has to be big enough in relative terms. Second, the connection between gender equality and state funding must be very strong. So, for example, some countries say that 5% of the money is distributed in relation to how many women candidates are. No. More effective, I think, to penalize, to reverse it, and say that the fewer women you have as candidates, the less money you get. Down to a point that if you don't have enough women candidates, you're not going to get any sort of funding at all. Well, why should we give taxpayers money to people who don't believe in gender equality? And the third thing is that it also relates to the views in society about the role of women and men in politics. Because political parties want to win elections. And when they feel that we have to nominate a man to be able to win, and they can show that they're justified, they're going to do that, even if you are a moving state. Because the primary goal for a political party is to win elections. So you also need to work with the voters and explain why women are fairly often better, but at least as good politicians. And to do that, if that is too strong, then state funding, whatever you do with it, is not going to make it. When we had a survey in the Maldives last year, showed that 2/3 of average people didn't believe in gender equality. That included women and men. Finally, what's the trend about member contributions to political parties? Yes, very clear. It's gone. With the exceptions I mentioned, some extent in the Netherlands and a little bit in Germany, and extremist parties. Parties very far on the left or very far on the right. They tend to get it because they don't get any other money. So they tend to get money from their members. But for very few parties that play a role in national politics around the world have a significant income from their parties. Maybe the era of membership parties is gone. It certainly is in my country, where everyone's supporting them. In many parts of the world, the era of membership parties never stopped. There's no African party, the African party outside of the ANC that has a membership voluntarily. Maybe we should think more in terms of grassroots support. Whether the persons are direct members of the party or not. But if we can attract a lot of people to give us small amounts of money because we're showing them that we have good policies and good ideas for how to govern Indonesia, maybe that's the one.
Pertama kita sampaikan terima kasih kepada Pak Magnus Ohman. Mungkin kita kasih aplaus lagi ya sekali lagi. Ini luar biasa. 3 jam kita bersama-sama lebih hari ini dan banyak sekali. Saya kira yang mahal itu adalah ilmu komparasinya ya. Karena kalau kita baca sendiri, kita harus baca buku tebal-tebal gitu. Nah, Pak Magnus Ohman hari ini mensummarikannya untuk kita. Semoga ini juga menjadi pemicu kita untuk terus memperbaiki kualitas pendanaan politik kita. Tapi yang menarik tadi disampaikan adalah kalau cari yang ideal gitu ya, tidak ada skema yang paling ideal untuk suatu negara, contoh dari negara lain. Yang ada adalah elaborasi kita sendiri dengan banyak faktor tadi disebutkan, misalnya bagaimana politik dan lokal konteks juga itu mempengaruhi kita dalam menentukan sistem yang akan kita pilih. Jadi Ini hampir serupa dengan yang pernah disampaikan Pak Andrew Reynolds. Kalau tanya sistem pemilu apa yang paling ideal, itu tidak ada katanya. Yang ada itu sistem pemilu yang cocok. Nah, ini juga yang harus kita jadi PR di Indonesia, mencari solusi pendanaan politik yang cocok untuk negara kita. Karena memang setiap negara punya kekhasan dan problemnya masing-masing. Dan yang terpenting adalah kita bisa belajar dari negara lain, tapi ya tidak ada yang paling ideal untuk suatu negara. Kita yang harus menemukannya sendiri. Terima kasih, thank you so much Dr. Ohman untuk kehadirannya hari ini. Semoga ini bukan kunjungan terakhir ke Indonesia, dan ini menjadi modalitas kita masyarakat sipil untuk bekerja sama dengan pembentuk undang-undang, dengan media, dengan kelompok masyarakat sipil, betul-betul sungguh-sungguh untuk memperbaiki dan mereformasi keuangan politik kita. Walaupun tadi dikatakan tidak ada negara yang keuangan politiknya bukan menjadi masalah, tapi setidaknya janganlah kita yang paling buruk masalahnya Indonesia. Terima kasih teman-teman. Mohon maaf kalau ada yang kurang berkenan atau suasananya agak hangat. Ini hitung-hitung kita sauna ya. Gitu. Semoga kita punya kesempatan untuk kuliah-kuliah umum berikutnya ya. Jadi kalau ada kunjungan orang-orang seperti Pak Magnus Ohman, kami akan berusaha untuk menyelenggarakan kegiatan yang sama. Terima kasih, semoga bermanfaat. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.